Alright, boys and girls, get those time machines ready. We're going back, way back. Before we begin, the good people at NoBullshit.com would like to remind any potential viewers that there are several platforms that advocate the espousal of identity politics. Here we make the attempt to be objective. So we ask that you put on your big boy pants and big girl pants, divorce any emotions, and listen to the show in its entirety. For some Americans, the idea of race relations has become more of an annoyance than something necessarily beneficial to the overall future of the country. A series of uncomfortable conversations that up till now can only be likened to a dog chasing its tail. The dichotomy of race in this country can either be defined as an elaborate secret conspiracy, the participants consisting of a multitude of nations and ethnic groups globally. Maybe it's the media that's taught us all to discriminate against each other in all aspects of human interaction. Does the economic atmosphere in the United States foster tribalism? Is it harder for us to rally behind the ideals of America because Americans are fed a steady diet of propaganda which serves to drive a wedge between the various socioeconomic groups? Equality, the most coveted buzzword of the 1950s and 60s, but after the passing of the civil rights laws, is it just that? A word? Can the cold, gripping clutch of oppression's hand simply be boiled down to poor values, childhood abuse, predatory leadership, and a lack of political savvy? Is the voyeuristic nature of American society in general to blame? The no accountability clause that allows us to be absolved of all guilt? Do we all participate in a micro stampede on personal freedoms in the name of political correctness? Daily, we marginalize tragedies. We overlook our personal shortcomings and worship at the monolithic altar of group identity. In an endless tit for tat, a swirl of sentencing inequality versus black on black crime, poorly funded schools versus poorly organized family structures, economic disenfranchisement versus generational financial illiteracy, the slave master versus the super predator. Is America locked in a perpetual yin and yang? If so, would it be racist if I made an Asian joke? America's views about race are very much a social construct. In fact, it can be traced back to the Enlightenment era thinkers. In its development, scientific racial ideas didn't always involve the color cast, as it would later on in the Americas. For instance, historian Henri Boulainvilliers divided the French into two races, the aristocratic, or the French race, descended from the invader Germanic Franks, and the Gallo-Roman race. As you would imagine from the word aristocratic, the Frankish aristocracy dominated the Gauls. Makes sense considering the idea of monolithic race structures is all about domination and power, as we'll get into. Another French philosopher, Voltaire, wrote, "The Negro race is a species of men different from ours, as the breed of Spaniels is from that of greyhounds. The mucous membrane or network which nature has spread between the muscles and skin is white in us and black or copper-colored in them." In 1735, Carl Linnaeus, a Swedish natural scientist, published Systema Naturae. He accounted for a hierarchical classification system that ranked humans based on appearance. Linnaeus ranked the human species from best to worst. Number one, of course, white. Phlegm, strong and optimistic. 2. Native American, blood. Linnaeus liked huntsmen. 3. Asian, yellow, bile, depressive and rigid. 4. African, black bile, dull and lazy. About 40 years later, German anthropologist and physician Johann Friedrich Blumenbach used the study of 60 skulls to reduce all of humanity into 5 groups: the Caucasian or white race, the Mongolian or yellow race, the Malayan or brown race, the Ethiopian or black race, and the American or red race. These ideas about race continue to get more fantastic. Take, for instance, the Americanus, red, choleric, righteous, black, straight, thick hair, stubborn, zealous, free, painting himself with red lines, and regulated by customs. The Europeanus, white, sanguine, brawny, with abundant, long hair, blue eyes, gentle, acute, inventive, covered with close vestments, and governed by laws. The Asiaticus, yellow, melancholic, stiff, black, dark eyes, severe, haughty, greedy, covered with loose clothing, and ruled by opinion. The Afar, or Africanus, black, phlegmatic, relaxed, black, frizzled hair, silky skin, flat nose, tumid lips, females without shame, mammary glands, give milk abundantly, crafty, sly, lazy, cunning, lustful, careless, anoints himself with grease, and governed by caprice. And the monstros were mythologic humans, which didn't appear in the first editions of Systema Naturae. The subspecies included the four-footed, mute, hairy Homo foralis. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, old Carl believed in Bigfoot and werewolves. Prior to this, in the Americas, Africans and indigenous Americans termed as Negroes were not necessarily viewed as subhuman. When did this begin? Well, in an interview with PBS, Ira Berlin, a distinguished university professor of history at the University of Maryland, expressed a different opinion about race than is widely accepted today. He states, "The 17th century Chesapeake area is indeed a multiracial society. Native Americans, people of African descent, and people of European descent are jumbled up in a variety of ways. And they do the kinds of things that people do when they get jumbled up together. They work together, they play together, they fight, and they sleep together." Before the color codification of Americas, people distinguished themselves by religious differences, the Protestants and the Catholics, by nationality, such as distinguishing between Dutch and French and English. The English viewed themselves different from the Scots and Welsh, and all of them distinguished themselves from the Irish. The Irish are viewed beneath the English because of their kind of semi-nomadic existence, their organization into clans, which is viewed as primitive, and not to mention they're Catholic. The Protestants don't like the Catholics, and vice versa. And from the English point of view, if there is a group in Europe appropriate to enslave, of course that group would be the Irish. The Irish, like the Africans, predominantly came to the United States at that time as forced and coerced labor. Many Irish who were among the UK's underclass were sentenced to indentured servitude in the colonies as an alternative to death sentences for petty crimes. Considering the Jamestown colony was very much a corporate holding of King James I, he may very well have had the first prison industrial complex, but we'll discuss that later. Berlin continues. In the early stages of America, though, people of African descent escape from these forms of coerced labor and begin to behave pretty much like everybody else. They either use a skill to make a living as a paid hand, or they get some land of their own and participate in the quote-unquote coerced labor. The hierarchical structure of America was not, at this time, based on race, but on wealth. I'm not saying there was no discrimination, but every dark-skinned person was not a slave, and none were necessarily considered subhuman. There were distinctions made between blacks and whites, which may have really been a mutual sense of superiority, as any foreign group may have, being thrust together. Robert Boyle, an Anglo-Irish natural philosopher, in his writings mentioned that at this time, for European eyes, beauty was not measured so much in color, but in stature, comely symmetry of the parts of the body, and good features in the face. In the colonial years, while conditions were more fluid, white women, indentured servants or free, and African men, servant, slave, or free, made unions. Because the women were free, their mixed-race children were born free. They and their descendants formed most of the families of free people of color during the colonial period in Virginia. In 1789, Olaudah Equiano, a former slave from Nigeria who was enslaved in North America, published his autobiography. He advocated interracial marriage between whites and blacks. Multiculturalism was accepted, and this may be the only time that America was, in fact, a melting pot. But what changed? Bacon's Rebellion was an armed rebellion in 1676 by Virginia settlers led by Nathaniel Bacon against the rule of Governor William Berkeley and his refusal to retaliate for a series of Indian attacks on the frontier settlements. The Virginia colonists also wanted to further encroach on the tribal territories to the west, along with other challenges, including leaving Bacon out of his inner circle, refusing to allow Bacon to be part of his fur trade with the Indians. Helped motivate him to incite this popular uprising against Berkeley, who had failed to address the demands of the colonists regarding their safety. 1,000 Virginians of all classes and races took up arms against Berkeley, attacking Indians, chasing Berkeley from Jamestown, Virginia, and ultimately torching the capital. The alliance between indentured servants and Africans, united by their similar social status, disturbed the ruling class. The response? To incentivize discrimination, giving birth to America's infamous racial caste system, and to chattel slavery in an attempt to divide the two races from subsequent united uprisings with the passage of both anti-miscegenation laws of 1691-92 and the Virginia Slave Codes of 1705. The anti-miscegenation laws barred blacks and whites from marrying or having sex. According to theory, this ban on interracial marriage was issued to split up the increasingly mixed-race labor force into whites, who were given their freedom, which for the most part did not include any economic mobility, and blacks, who were later treated as slaves as opposed to the white counterparts, the indentured servants. The black and white groupings seemed to do two things. They would serve to divide the many different national and religious groups from Europe, and later the quote-unquote white Indians, who were removed from the prohibition of anti-miscegenation laws a decade prior, into one largely overpowering majority who held the power, even if only by a few. By forbidding interracial marriage, it became possible to keep these two new groups separated and prevent a new rebellion. The slave codes would establish new property rights for slave owners, allowed for legal, free trade of slaves with protection granted by the courts, established separate courts of trial, prohibited blacks, regardless of free status, from owning weapons, whites could not be employed by blacks, and allowed for the capture of suspected runaways. One big dilemma for this era of human excellence was egalitarianism. The colonists wanted autonomy from England and its social hierarchy. And 70 years after the passage of the slave codes, America had declared war against its master, the British Empire. Whites no longer considered themselves Europeans, but as something separate from their mother country. Thomas Jefferson was a major spokesperson for the concept of equality of all men. Though Jefferson was quite a paradoxical figure, the author of the Declaration of Independence, a man steeped in the egalitarian revolutionary traditions of the late 18th century, was also a slaveholder. How did he reconcile this? Well, in his notes on the state of Virginia, he is one of the first to raise the idea that, as a possibility, he says, that black people are different than white people, that Africans are different than Europeans. perhaps more suitable to be in bondage. Interestingly enough, as many of us know, Jefferson sired 6 children with a slave, Sally Hemings, later in his life, whom he had a 40-year relationship with, though never marrying. Despite positing that African were inherently less human than Europeans, suggesting earlier on that the indigenous American population be bred into the colonial European population, it seems as if Jefferson wrestled with his opinion of blacks, or he was really into bestiality. After the American Revolution, Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Man, the consensus is that all men are created equal. Equality is the point of egalitarianism, isn't it? And what must now be explained for the first time in the world is inequality and why it exists. Why are some men and women still slaves? The resounding answer becomes, because those men and women are black. This is where the Europeans begin to divorce their ideas about Christianity, or should I say, the validity of monogenesis, or simply the Adam and Eve theory. They begin to adopt polygenesis and the racial concepts we've already covered. Wonderful. So whites were able to continue their newfound equality and fellowship of man, while the blacks could be deemed as livestock, and at best pets, and in the case of those like Jefferson, the kind that were great to snuggle up with. But were not deserving of the concessions granted to the rest of the human family. Despite all this, the Revolutionary War does have contradictory effects on slavery. The northern states either abolish the institution outright or adopt gradual emancipation strategies. The revolution also inspires African American resistance against slavery. During the revolution, thousands of slaves obtained their freedom by running away, while others, like Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey, chose the sword as a means of gaining freedom. Slaves and free blacks fought for the Continentals and for the British during the war. Altogether, some 5,000 free blacks and slaves served in the Continental Army. Many states, including Virginia, granted freedom to slaves who served in the Revolutionary War. Some of them would even go on to become slaveholders. The plantation was a source of wealth in America. It was viewed as being a part of America to own slaves, before baseball and apple pie. Thank you for joining us for part 1 of his racism bullshit. As you can imagine, this is a very big conversation, so we split it up a little bit, because I know you have a short attention span, just like everybody else. Well, anyhow, you all have a good night, or day, whatever. Oh yeah, like, comment, subscribe. That means you.